Hi, divergence and typicals with or without alcohol issues. Last week, I shared with you my story of how I got into alcohol. This week, I'm going to go into some of the research out there on the topic, and I'm going to share the links down below the video. So let's start. Sarah Hendricks and Matthew Tinsley co-wrote a book on the topic called Asperger's Syndrome and Alcohol. And I have the book over here, and I suggest anyone who is interested in that topic to read this book. I can say for me, I found myself in so many occasions in the book that it was just incredible. In the first article from 2016 called Autism and Alcohol on the National Autistic Society website, Matt shares his story. Matt used alcohol to cope with his constant anxiety, and he says it made him feel more like a neurotypical. Added to that, drinking also numbed his hypersensitivity to noise and to touch at the workplace. In his words, he was also able to retain more information at work instead of being overwhelmed by it. Eventually, his alcohol habit turned into a serious health issue after 17 years of using it as a coping mechanism at the workplace. And not only at the workplace, but in life in general. He had to stop, otherwise, he risked a certain death. Further in the article, Matt proposes that a lot of autistic individuals might go unnoticed as a lot of substance misuse institutions require you to first be dry before they can offer any assistance. And since alcohol is a coping strategy for a lot of people on the spectrum, it becomes nearly impossible for them to seek treatment if they're required to stop first. This is because they start experiencing extreme anxiety, and the removal of alcohol can make them incapable of even leaving their own house. I want to add my own example of quitting here. For the first 3 months, I was indeed afraid to leave my apartment. I was worried I'm not going to be able to make it out there and I would start drinking again. When I eventually started going out, I was avoiding the places where I would usually drink in the past for another few months. This was until I had finally turned the mental switch off for alcohol. This was one of the scariest and hardest periods of my life. So, back to the article. Matt later continues with ways to recognize an autistic person with alcohol problems. He says that people should be on the lookout for unusual eye contact, special interests, nerdiness or expertise in a given topic, as well as peculiar use of language. Last but not least, people can come out as being autistic even if they're not diagnosed, and this should never be dismissed. A real diagnosis is often what helps a person with autism understand how they really feel and why they experience so many difficulties. He goes further to suggest that cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, which is adapted for autistic individuals, can help them immensely with their crippling anxiety, which is very often the root cause of their alcohol misuse. The next article I want to cover is from the Journal of Alcoholism and Drug Dependence, and it's from 2014. The article is titled Addiction and Autism: A Remarkable Comorbidity? Question mark. It explores the connection and possible comorbidity between substance use disorder and disorders like autistic spectrum disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder, and attention deficit and hyperactivity disorder. The article proposes that there is a genetic predisposition and vulnerability which interact with environmental factors such as early and current stress levels. These affect the proper functioning of the corticostriatal dopaminergic regulation systems. It states that there is evidence that ASD and SUD share dysregulations in the limbic and sensory motor corticostriatal regulation loops. The article kicks off with two stories of young people with substance use issues. One of them, a guy named Peter, is admitted to detox at the age of 20 with severe alcohol addiction. Just like me, he would get aggressive when parents or other people would try to obstruct his drinking. After detox, he went for rehabilitation where he was given a normal everyday task to do some shopping and afterwards joined the therapy group for a session. After doing the shopping, he started arranging his things in the cart and a nurse interrupted him to join the group. He had a meltdown. He started bashing doors, broke a window, and made threats to the nurse. He was immediately terminated from the rehabilitation program. However, he came back to the detox clinic a week later and he was asked why did he burst out like this. His answer was that it was due to the interruption. Later, they found out from his parents and from school reports that in his childhood he was diagnosed with Asperger's. Alcohol had become the answer for him for facing social situations. Next story is about a 14-year-old girl who was arrested for dealing drugs. It also turned out that she was sexually abused by her dealers, who she thought were friends of hers. She used to be an antisocial, smart girl in primary school with special interests in nature. In her later school years, she turned to gaming. Eventually, she found a company who were drinking and using speed, and she found out that this is easing up her social anxiety. Later, after she managed to detox, she was back to the smart, clumsy, and socially aloof girl. After sharing the two stories, the article continues with exploring the higher share of autism diagnosis amongst people admitted for substance misuse. Also, all 8 men out of the 118 patients admitted for the study were later diagnosed with autism. You can follow the link down below to see the table and compare the percentages of comorbidities between substance abuse and different conditions such as autism spectrum disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder, and ADHD. You can also see the link there between the various conditions explored in the study and the particular substance of abuse. The article then moves on to describe addiction from the autistic perspective. It shares a book called A Real Person: Life on the Outside. There, the author Gunilla Gerland, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, shares her addictions. Many of them share similarities with repetitive and obsessive behaviors common in autistic individuals. The paper then goes on to describe these similarities in detail. This segment includes preoccupations with special interests for autistic individuals and with substances for addicts. It compares alleviating social and other anxieties, dopaminergic stimulation, and more in people with ASD, OCD, ADHD, and SUD. In this section of the paper, the authors propose a neurobiological link between ASD and SUD. Studies show an overlap in dysregulation of the corticostriatal circuits between people with SUD, ASD, ADHD, and OCD, and the link is present in both animals and humans. The dopaminergic dysregulation was shown in 3 corticostriatal pathways in these studies. The sensory motor loop, which would manifest in conditions like Parkinson's disease and Huntington's disease. The cognitive corticostriatal loop is impaired in people with ADHD. And the limbic corticostriatal loop is disrupted when addictive behavior is present. With autism, all 3 of these circuits are dysregulated. There is a controversial, in my personal point of view, research that I wanted to include in this video from 2021. It is titled Risk of Substance Use Disorder and its Associations with Comorbidities and Psychotropic Agents in Patients with Autism. In short, I'll tell you what this study found out from 6,599 patients with autism and 26,396 patients as controls without ASD. It is that people with autism are at a higher risk of developing a substance use disorder, especially if they have developed a behavioral disorder. The percentage is lower if patients with ASD are treated with psychotropic agents, however. These are the findings, and since I have not been medicated for my condition, as I found out about it later in life, I don't really know if medication would have made any difference, but I assume that the results from the study are accurate. However, I want to add my personal point of view that the medications currently prescribed for people on the spectrum, be it children or adults, have a lot of side effects. So I hope that there will be much better solutions for treatment in the future. One of them I can share from my own personal experience is the stem cell therapy I underwent. It alleviated some of my symptoms, such as hypersensitivity to light and sounds, and to some extent my social anxiety in given situations. The results are not perfect, but it definitely helped to a great extent. There are also a few other solutions that can help an autistic person navigate their condition better, and I'm going to talk about them as well as the stem cell therapy in future videos. My take from this study, however, is that people with ASD are at a much higher chance of developing substance use disorder if they're not treated properly or if they're not treated on time. And simple solutions like cognitive behavioral therapy adapted for autism that was proposed in the first article I shared can offer great help in preventing autistic individuals from developing addictions. The next study I want to cover is Autism Spectrum Disorder and Substance Abuse Disorder, a systematic review. It gives a broad perspective on the issue, evaluating a number of studies that have been done in the past. It shows that substance abuse might be underdiagnosed in neurodevelopmental disorders although the number of studies showing that is limited. The research expresses that many of the interventions that are used for addiction might be harmful to an autistic individual. These include 12-step programs as well as self-help groups, as these can induce more anxiety and anger in people with ASD. The social factor in such interventions might lead to discomfort, worsening the problem. Another finding is that IQ plays a role in increasing the chance of ASD and SUD occurring together. In general, SUD is more widespread in high functioning ASD, and people on that side of the spectrum tend to have higher than average IQs. The study also suggests that the subgroup of autistic individuals with higher risk of developing addictions is likely to be more socially engaged. The authors also mention an article in the Lancet journal surveying 374 individuals, 256 men, and 118 women with Asperger's syndrome. Two-thirds of them reported suicidal ideations, and 35 reported having plans or attempts at suicide. One-third of the men reported having depression as well. After I tried taking my own life more than 4.5 years ago, the depression that followed made me go even further into drinking. I'm definitely going to share more about this in future episodes. Finally, the study concludes that self-reports of autism should be taken into account, even though carefully. Moreover, the medical community should be more aware of the high occurrence of SUD in ASD and vice versa. The last article I want to cover in this video is from 2015. It is titled Substance Use Disorder in High-Functioning Autism: Clinical and Neurocognitive Insights from 2 Case Reports. What first stood out for me is that the authors say that people with ADHD are at a higher chance of developing addictions compared to those with ASD. This is due to the often introverted personality of autistic individuals. The article also goes to mention Matthew Tinsley from the first article I covered. The first case is about a 45-year-old man whose anxiety led him to wander the streets at day and night, which I am guilty of doing myself. He was very socially naive, and he would also only talk to people about his special interests. Something that I also struggle with, although it has gotten a bit better. He also exhibited ritualistic and restricted behavior. When his routine or schedule changed from a bus being late, for instance, he would become so anxious that he would start to crave alcohol or cigarettes. He eventually became addicted and was later diagnosed with alcohol and tobacco use disorder according to the DSM-4. In 1989, he was misdiagnosed with bipolar disorder and he was treated with medication for it. By 2009, he was taking bipolar, epilepsy, and depression meds. For alcohol withdrawal, he was given diazepam. I would like to make a separate video on alcohol withdrawal and using benzodiazepines to treat it. I have a very different opinion on that subject matter compared to a lot of clinicians. Anyway, back to the story. The guy often got hospitalized for alcohol intoxication, behavioral disorders, and depression. This only made doctors increase his medication. In 2012, he was also given antipsychotic meds and he was treated for alcohol dependence with two other medications unsuccessfully. Finally, he got diagnosed with high functioning autism and his care reorganized completely. He started going to his appointments, started taking care of himself, and limited his alcohol intake to only 3 cans of beer per day. Because of cognitive behavioral therapy, he got better with his social skills, his flexibility, his emotions, and more. The next story is about a 55-year-old divorced man who was treated for addiction by the clinic who published this paper. He was hospitalized for anorexia back in 1973 and was suffering regularly from depression. In 2002, he was given an SSRI or selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor for his depression. He was later treated with another SSRI and finally with an SNRI, serotonin and noradrenaline reuptake inhibitor. He had developed an addiction for black tea and alcohol, tea during the day and alcohol at night. After starting a cognitive behavioral therapy and remediation therapy at the clinic, the man shared that his executive memory and his working memory have improved a bit. However, later he discontinued his treatments. The article continues on to propose that in those two case reports, the comorbidity between ASD and SUD was due to their anxiety and frequent depression. Matthew Tinsley and his book are mentioned again, pointing out the lack of social skills as a factor that can contribute to alcohol dependency in patients with psychiatric conditions. On the other hand, psychostimulants such as nicotine and caffeine can help autistic individuals alleviate neurocognitive difficulties. In both cases, this delayed the autism diagnosis because they were first treated for other conditions. The paper then concludes that clinicians need to improve in diagnosing both autism and SUD in autism. All the articles point to one conclusion, that is, autism is misdiagnosed and underdiagnosed in people with substance use disorder. This is a topic I want to shine more light on in my channel. So this is it for this video, guys. I hope you enjoyed it and I hope to see you next time. Until then, may peace be with you.